A single flickering tallow flame fought the vast starless black of the forest floor, its light a fragile, defiant pinprick against the consuming dark. It caught the dust motes dancing in the cold air, revealing the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, a silent, watchful sentinel whose branches reached toward a sky choked with unseen stars. The scent of damp earth and frost-bitten ferns filled the air, mingling with the sweet smoke of herbs burned long before the first Christian cross was hammered into the ground. A girl, her face pale in the uncertain light, knelt before the tree. Her hands, rough from fieldwork, trembled slightly. Her feet were bare despite the numbing chill, a token of reverence her grandmother had demanded. Her coarse, heavy cloak was pulled tight, but it could not shield her from the deeper cold that had settled in her bones, the cold of a hidden knowledge. This was her 11th winter, and the first time her grandmother had brought her to this sacred, silent place. She was no longer just Elfric's daughter, the child who gathered rushes in the fen. Tonight, in this forbidden grove, she was a vessel, a fragile keeper of memory. The old woman's hands, dry and cracked like river clay, moved with a practiced grace she had only ever seen in the simple ritual of kneading bread. But here, they were shaping something older, more sacred, a small clay effigy of the Horned One, a god feared and banished from every hall in Christendom. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the girl. It was the weight of this silence that was most terrifying, for it was filled not with the wind or the rustle of leaves, but with the ghosts of 1,000 generations. The firelight cast long, skeletal shadows, and for a moment, the girl's own silhouette seemed to merge with the twisted branches above, becoming part of the forest's hidden, breathing heart. The old woman's voice was a dry whisper, a sound like rustling dead leaves. She spoke not to the girl, but to the memory in her hands, as if coaxing it back to life. She spoke of the land, of the way it gave and took, of the prayers offered not in stone cathedrals, but in the turning of the seasons. She spoke of the great stag that had been their god before the white-robed priests came with their book and their bell, a god of the hunt, of life and death, of the wild places that had never been tamed. The girl looked at the clay figure, its horns sharp and defined in the wavering light, and felt a strange pull. It was not a pull toward evil, as the priests preached, but a pull toward the earth itself, toward the raw, honest hunger of a world that did not care for saints. She thought of the lessons in the village hall, where a traveling priest spoke of a distant heaven, of a paradise far away from the mud and the cold. But here, her grandmother was teaching her to find paradise in the mud, in the promise of the coming spring, in the very air she breathed. The old woman's hands moved, carving lines into the clay, each one a syllable of a forgotten prayer. The girl's fear was a tight knot in her stomach, a coil of guilt, and a thrilling defiance. The scent of wood smoke and old herbs filled her lungs, and for the first time, she felt a connection not to a distant shining god, but to the cold, hard ground beneath her bare feet. The ritual was simple, yet profound. The effigy was placed in the hollow of the great oak's roots, a small offering of milk poured over it. The old woman's eyes, clouded with 1,000 years of memory, met the girl's. They were eyes that had seen the coming of the new faith, had watched the old sacred groves cut down and replaced with churches. They held a wisdom born of silence, of hiding, of passing on a secret, not through words, but through gestures. This was not a faith of grand cathedrals, but a faith of survival, of a deep-seated refusal to let go of the roots that held them to this land. The grandmother spoke of the village well, of the spring it drew from, and whispered that this was where the true gods lived now, in the places the priests had forgotten to consecrate. As the tallow flame guttered and died, plunging them into the cold and the dark, the girl felt the weight of her inheritance. She was no longer just a child. She was a link in a chain that stretched back beyond memory, a keeper of a flame that had been banned, but never truly extinguished. They moved like ghosts back through the forest, leaving behind the dark, silent sentinel. The cold air was sharp and clean, but the scent of wood smoke still clung to her cloak. When they returned to the warmth of their hovel, the girl looked at the rough wooden crucifix on the wall, a gift from the priest. It seemed smaller, colder, and somehow more foreign than it ever had before. The world outside had not changed. The distant chime of the monastery bell still carried on the wind, but the world inside her had shifted. She was now part of a great secret, a quiet rebellion, and she knew that the silence she had felt in the forest was not emptiness. It was waiting. The new world, with its grand hymns and Latin verses, had a name for this waiting. They called it heresy, but the old woman had simply called it memory. And the fight to preserve that memory had only just begun. In the long, echoing hall of the abbot, where the scent of old parchment and beeswax clung to the air like a ghost, Brother Thomas felt a profound disquiet. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the drafts whispering through the stone windows, but a chill that had settled deep within his soul. The scratch of his quill on the vellum was a dutiful, familiar sound, a rhythmic prayer of his own. But today, the letters of the Gospels seemed to swim on the page, their certainty unable to quiet the storm brewing within him. He was meant to be transcribing the Word of God, but his gaze kept returning to a single stone window, a portal to a world that defied his holy work. Through it, he could see the stooped figure of a villager, a woman known to all as Alara. She was a simple, pious woman. She attended Mass, she confessed her sins, she gave alms. Yet, there was a deep well of knowledge in her eyes, a kind of ancient memory that had always troubled him. He had seen the way she would touch the lichen-covered stones of the standing circle on her way to Mass, a gesture so swift it could be mistaken for a stumble. He remembered her hands, calloused from weaving and tending to her small, hard-won garden, tying sprigs of rowan over her door on the feast of St. John. The priests preached it was for the saint's blessing, but in his mind, he could hear the old women's hushed whispers speaking of protection from an older, wilder goddess who still held court in the shadows. The abbot's bell rang, a hollow, iron-tongued sound that was supposed to drive away all evil, to banish the spirits of the old world with its holy clangor. But to Thomas, today, it sounded like a frantic, desperate attempt to drown out a deeper, more stubborn memory. It was the sound of a new fortress being built on ancient, hallowed ground, a place where the gods of the forest and the river were not gone, but merely sleeping. He had come to believe, in the long, solitary hours of his transcription, that the God he served was a fortress built on sand. His faith, so pure and bright in the eyes of the church, felt like a thin veil stretched over a wild, untamed land. He looked down at the Latin words on his page, so logical and certain, but he could still feel the rustle of Alara's homespun cloak as she moved through the forest, a whisper of a forgotten name on the wind. He remembered a day years ago when a plague of rust had swept through the fields, rotting the grain in its stalk. The abbot had preached of fasting and prayer, of God's divine test. But in the village, Thomas had seen the men and women gathering beneath the moon, the smoke of burning offerings rising from the edge of the woods, a silent supplication to something older, something they believed had the power to heal the earth itself. They had not defied the church. They had simply turned to a different kind of truth. He saw it in the way the fishermen would spit on their nets before casting them, a small, forgotten ritual. He saw it in the way the midwives would hang small bags of herbs over the cradles of newborns, speaking softly in a dialect that predated the Latin Mass. This was not a heresy of grand public displays, but a heresy of the heart, a quiet rebellion of the bones and the blood. The abbot's hall, with its high arches and its holy texts, was a place of ordered faith. But the world outside was a place of 1,000 little faiths, a wild, tangled web of beliefs that no sermon could ever truly unravel. He felt a deep, unsettling empathy for Alara, for all of them. They were not evil, not damned. They were simply people trying to survive, trying to find a footing in a world that had abandoned them for a God who felt so distant, so far away, so cold. The stone floor of the monastery was cold and hard, but he imagined the feeling of the soft, damp earth beneath Alara's feet, the ancient ground that remembered the names of her ancestors. The certainty of his faith was a fragile thing, a house of cards that could be toppled by the scent of wood smoke, the sound of a distant river, or the quiet, knowing look in an old woman's eyes. As dusk began to settle, the light through the window shifted from a stark white to a softer, bruised purple. He put his quill down. The ink-stained vellum felt impossibly heavy, filled with a truth that no longer felt complete. He looked out the window one last time, past the village, toward the tree line where the forest began, a dark, impenetrable fortress against the world of men and their churches. Alara was gone, but the impression of her passage remained, a whisper in the silent, waiting air. He wondered what she saw when she looked at the great monastery bell tower, if it was a symbol of hope or a monument to a beautiful, terrifying loss. He wondered which god truly answered her prayers, and if a prayer whispered to the earth could ever be louder than a prayer shouted from a stone cathedral. He looked at the perfect, scripted words on his page, so clean, so pure, and knew that they were only half the story. The other half was out there, in the rustle of the trees and the secrets of the mud, and its silence was deafening. The wind that swept down from the high passes carried with it the metallic tang of coming snow and the faint, mournful scent of a dying season. It howled against the stone keep of Lord Geraint, a place of hard angles and Christian virtues, a fortress built not just of rock, but of rigid order and unwavering piety. Within its great hall, a young woman named Isolde moved like a shadow. Her face, a pale canvas against the vivid crimson tapestries that celebrated the lives of saints and martyrs, was an expression of perfect, courtly piety. But her serenity was a lie, a carefully constructed performance she had perfected since girlhood. In her hands, as she mended a silk surcoat with a needle of polished silver, she would knot the threads in patterns known only to her grandmother. They were not for aesthetics, but for whispers of old protections against the dark. A binding of luck, a shield against ill will, a secret prayer hidden within the fabric of the new world. Her duty was to her lord and to the court, a life of outward devotion to a faith that felt cold and distant. Her faith was outwardly pledged to the new god, but her heart was a chamber locked with a key of braided horsehair, a key she would never show. She would close her eyes, and the opulent hall with its roaring hearth would vanish, replaced by a memory of the secret grove. She could feel the cool, damp earth beneath her bare feet and the rough bark of the ancient trees. She could see her mother, a woman who had never known these tapestries or this silver needle, teaching her how to pour milk for the spirits of the spring. She could hear the wild, laughing dances they would perform when the moon was full, a sound more honest and vibrant than any courtly music. Her entire life now was a performance, every gesture an act of conformity. The silk robes, a mark of her station, felt like a shroud. The gold cross she wore, a heavy and cold weight against her skin, was a constant physical reminder of the lie she lived. The bells of the keep's chapel rang out, a constant, insistent rhythm that sought to banish all doubt, all memory, all that was not of the new faith. They were meant to be the voice of God, a sound of holy certainty. But to Isolde, their iron-tongued clangor seemed to stir something else entirely in the bones of the earth itself, an old, persistent echo that no bell could ever truly silence. It was the sound of a world buried but not forgotten, a whisper beneath the surface. Her hands, so elegant and controlled as they performed their daily tasks of mending and weaving, would sometimes twitch with an involuntary urge to dig into the soil, to feel the cold, honest dirt that remembered a world before kings and priests, before bells and crosses. The guilt she carried was not just the fear of discovery, but a dull, constant ache beneath her ribs, the quiet rebellion of a heart that refused to be converted. She had to be a silent warrior. Her battle was not fought with steel, but with thread and gesture, with the secret language of her heart. She was alone in this. Her lord was a man of piety and law, a firm believer in the church's dominion. Her ladies-in-waiting gossiped of saints and relics, of pilgrimages and prayers. Isolde was a fortress of one, guarding a flame that she knew in her bones was the true fire. She was both court lady and witch, pious soul and pagan spirit, and the two could never fully merge. The chasm between these two lives was a vast, cold expanse, and her greatest fear was that one day she might fall into it, lost forever between two worlds. As the last light of the winter day bled from the hall, leaving the tapestries in shadow, she finished her mending. She ran her fingers over the surcoat, feeling the hidden knots beneath the smooth silk, a secret she would carry into the dark. Her gaze drifted to the high, narrow window, not to the court below, but to the forest that began where the keep's defenses ended. The wind howled again, but this time it sounded different. It was not a mournful sound, but a voice, a promise. It whispered to her of a world where the gods had not been banished but merely driven into hiding, a world of waiting and of resilience. The light of the single torch she held cast long, dancing shadows on the wall, and for a moment her own shadow seemed to detach from her, becoming something wild and free. She wore the gilded cage of her life with grace, but she knew the cage was not the whole of her. The quiet rebellion had begun, a whisper in the heart of the enemy's fortress, and its fate hung on a thread of silk, a hidden knot, and the silent, stubborn memory of the earth. Beneath the sprawling canopy of the ancient forest, where the light filtered through the high leaves in shifting emerald shafts, a different kind of sanctuary thrived. This was not a place of carved stone altars or wrought silver chalices, but a cathedral of moss-covered logs and cupped hands. It was here, in the heart of the wild silence, that a man with eyes as old as the gnarled roots he walked upon, a man with a faith that had no name in the new world, kept the old ways alive. He was a traveling shaman, a forgotten priest of a forgotten world, and his very existence was a defiant prayer. He spoke a language that had been silenced in the halls of men. It was the language of rustling leaves and creaking wood, of the buzz of bees as they moved between wildflowers, of the shiver of water over stone. He knew the properties of every berry, the songs of every bird, not just as a healer and a hunter, but as a devout follower. His gods were not in the heavens, distant and abstract, but in the soil beneath his feet. He could feel the pulse of the great horned one in the life-giving flow of the river, and the wild, untamed spirit of the forest queen in the fierce cry of a hunting hawk. His faith was not a set of dogmas, but a direct, physical dialogue with the land itself. When the priests in their distant monasteries spoke of God's grand design, a tapestry of logic and divine will, he would think of the delicate veins on a single leaf, a pattern more beautiful and complex than any stained glass window. To him, the church was a fortress built against nature, a fear of the wild and the unknown. But his faith embraced it. He walked with a carved staff, not a symbol of earthly power or authority, but a living conduit to the spirits of the old world, a grounding rod that connected his heart to the earth's. His entire existence was a silent, unshakable refusal to believe that a faith so deeply rooted could be so easily uprooted. The silence of the deep woods was his cathedral, and the single low call of a hidden owl was his vespers. But this solitary worship was a dangerous one. He knew the stories of what happened to those who were found still clinging to the old gods. They were not simply corrected, they were cleansed. The world of men was closing in. He could smell it on the wind, the metallic scent of steel from a new lord's forge, the faint acrid smoke of a charcoal pit where the trees of his sacred forest were being turned into fuel for the new world. He knew his gods were not a match for a sharpened axe and the cold, unyielding will of a priest. So he moved through the woods like a ghost, his face a silent mask of reverence, his every step a hushed, careful prayer. He knelt by a clear, cold stream, its water tasting of rock and deep earth. He cupped his hands, a chalice of flesh and blood, and drank deeply. This was his communion. This was his truth. He imagined the taste of the bread and the wine of the new church, sterile and foreign, and knew in his bones that this simple, cold water held more divinity, more honest life, than all the blessed sacraments of the world. He was a keeper of the memory of what was lost, the last echo of a world that was being systematically forgotten. His faith was not a story in a book. It was the story of the very ground he stood upon. As the last emerald shafts of light faded and the forest sank into its deep velvet darkness, he felt a sudden shiver. It was not from the cold, but from a profound, gnawing loneliness. To be the last of something is not a privilege, it is a burden. He looked up at the great, twisting branches of the ancient oak above him. It had stood here for 1,000 years, watching the world change. Would it still be here in another 100, or would it be felled to make way for a lord's hall or a new monastery? The owl hooted again, a low, haunting sound that was both a prayer and a lament. It was the sound of a world receding, a god song fading into the night. His faith was a tiny, flickering flame in a vast, encroaching darkness. And he knew that for the old ways to survive, they would have to find a way to grow in the very shadows that were meant to consume them. The question was not how long he could hold on, but what would happen when he finally had to let go, and what, if anything, would be left behind. The rusted iron gates of the crumbling manor house were a symbol of both exile and defiance. They groaned on their hinges, a low, mournful sound, as the wind rattled through their rusted bars. This was the home of a woman who had lost everything: her title, her place in court, her easy life of warmth and light. Her once fine woolen cloak was now threadbare and patched, a shroud of memory. Her hands, once delicate and pale, were now rough from tending a small, raw, defiant garden that clung to the ruins. This was her new sacred ground, not with the manicured order of a monastery herb garden, but with the wild, untamed chaos of a faith refusing to be tamed. This woman was Maeve, and her crime was simple: a refusal to renounce the old ways. In a world where the new god demanded total devotion, Maeve had held fast to the old stories, to the gods of her ancestors who lived in the soil and the trees. For this, she had been cast out. She lived in a silence so profound it seemed to press down on the very air, a silence broken only by the wind and the whispers she spoke to her garden. She grew foxglove and wormwood, plants of potency and poison, speaking to them in a language the priests had long since forbidden, a language of roots and leaves and living earth. The cold wind rattling the shutters of the manor felt like the disapproving voice of the new world, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she was denying. Her life was a tapestry of loss, woven with threads of quiet defiance. She remembered the court of her youth, the smell of roasted meat and fine wine, the glint of torches on polished stone, the hymns of the chapel that seemed to fill every corner of her world. Now, her world was this one room: the sputtering hearth fire, the bitter taste of simple rye bread, and the overwhelming scent of damp stone and decay. Her isolation was a burden, a heavy mantle of loneliness that settled on her shoulders each night, but it was also a shield. In her solitude, she was safe. In her solitary devotion, she kept a flame alive that had gone out in the halls of power, a light that no one in the new world even knew existed. But at dusk, as the last light bled from the sky, her defiance was at its strongest. It was in the twilight, when the bells of the distant monastery finally faded into a memory, that Maeve would take her pilgrimage. Her feet would move not to a church, but to the loose floorboard in the corner of her room. She would lift it with a practiced hand and retrieve her truth: a small hand-carved bone, an effigy of the mother goddess. It was smooth to the touch, worn by generations of clandestine prayers. Its contours were not defined by dogma, but by the love and devotion of women who had to hide their prayers, who had to bury their gods just to survive. Holding it now, the warmth of her hand seeping into the cold bone, Maeve would whisper to it the names of her ancestors, those who had passed into the green world before the coming of the white-robed priests. She spoke of her mother, who had taught her the secret of the foxglove, of her grandmother, who had passed this very bone down to her with a look that said more than 1,000 words. It was a line of silent rebellion, a secret passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. The bitter scent of the dying hearth fire was a small price for the warmth of her unbroken faith, a warmth that radiated from this single sacred object. It was a warmth that came from knowing you were not alone, that even in this ruin, the old gods remembered you. The last embers of the fire glowed like tiny, defiant eyes in the gloom. The bone, now warm with her touch, was a beacon in the dark. But the night was long, and the cold was deep. She returned the effigy to its hiding place, feeling the weight of the floorboard settle back into place, a final, secret prayer. She was the last keeper of her line. She was a single, flickering candle against a storm. And as the wind howled outside, a sound that seemed to carry the cold judgment of the new world, she felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. What happens to a faith when its last keeper is a forgotten woman in a crumbling house? What happens when the final flame goes out? The next chapter of her story, she knew, would answer that question, and she was not certain she wanted to hear the answer. In the deep, claustrophobic chill of the crypt, a single candle fought a losing battle against a vast, consuming darkness. Its light danced upon the stone walls, turning the vaults into a grim procession of skulls and femurs, a silent, macabre gallery of the dead. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the profound silence of 1,000 forgotten breaths, pressed down upon a young acolyte. He was tasked with cataloging the bones of the long dead, the ancestors of the very villagers who now worshipped in the light of the new faith above. He had been taught that these were the bones of the ignorant, souls who had lived in a world of darkness before the light of the true faith had come to save them. He worked in a world of cold certainties. He knew the Latin, he knew the prayers, he knew that the holy book held all the truth that a man could ever need. He moved from bone to bone, his hands calloused from the work of a life dedicated to God, a life of stone and scripture. But as he reached into a small niche and his fingers closed around the skeletal hand of a long-dead woman, he felt something that was neither bone nor dust. He pulled it from her grasp, and the flickering candlelight revealed a small, smooth, water-worn stone. It was not a cross or a saint's medal. It was carved with ancient, interlocking lines that spoke a language older than Latin, a language of seasons and cycles, of the endless turning of the world. It smelled of river silt and something else, a faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a scent of life lived close to the ground, a life of wild things and primal fears. He knew, with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, that this amulet was forbidden. It was a relic of a time the priests had condemned as savage, a symbol of a god that had been buried in the very ground they now stood upon. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, where the stone was rough and uneven, a reminder of the raw, brutal power of the faith that had conquered this land. The bell from the church above tolled, a sonorous, powerful sound that shook the very foundation of the crypt. It was a sound meant to banish all evil, to assert the dominion of the new god over all that was old and wild. But holding the small, smooth stone, he felt a different kind of power, a silent, stubborn resilience. The bell was a cry of conquest, but the stone was a whisper of survival. It was a testament to a faith that had not been erased, but simply driven into the shadows, into the bones of the earth and the hearts of its people. His hands, which had only ever felt the cold of stone and the smoothness of vellum, now felt the warmth of this ancient truth. The smooth stone against his palm was a small physical rebellion. He was no longer just an acolyte doing his duty. He was a keeper of a secret, a witness to a truth that his entire world was built on denying. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and a strange, thrilling sense of discovery. He looked at the grim procession of bones around him and saw them not as ignorant pagans, but as people with their own prayers, their own beliefs, their own quiet truths. He slipped the amulet into his tunic, a small, hidden weight against his heart. It was a symbol of a forbidden truth, a secret that had survived 1,000 years of silence, a whisper in the dark that refused to die. It felt colder and heavier than any cross he had ever worn. As he finished his work and climbed the cold stone stairs out of the crypt, the light of the church above felt almost blinding. The familiar scent of incense and old wax, once so comforting, now felt like a perfumed shroud over a vast, forgotten graveyard. He looked up at the stained glass windows, so perfect and beautiful, and saw them not as a divine light, but as a carefully constructed veil, designed to filter out the wild, vibrant truths of the world outside. He walked past the altar, past the great wooden crucifix, the weight of the stone against his chest, a constant, silent question. He had entered the crypt as a servant of God, but he had left as a keeper of a secret. His faith, once a fortress, now felt like a house with a hidden door he had just opened. The next day, he would return to his transcription, to the words of a holy book that now felt incomplete. But he knew that the true story, the story of the earth and the bones and the silent, stubborn whispers of a forgotten faith, was only just beginning.